Who are our greatest presidents? What lessons can the modern-day business leader learn from our 46 chiefs of state? Find out in this podcast series with Tom Fox and Richard Lummis to delve into the great and not-so-great presidents to mine their successes and failures for today's business executive.
Richard Lummis, and I'm here with Tom Fox for another discussion on how to improve our leadership skills. Today's discussion is a continuation in our series on presidents of the United States. Continuing with the little-known Gilded Age Presidents, we'll be talking about James Garfield, our 20th president, who served for less than a year in 1881. Garfield was born in 1831 in Cuyahoga County, Ohio, son of a wrestler who died when he was 2. Grew up in poverty and was mocked by the other boys for being poor and fatherless, which left him sensitive to perceived slights the rest of his life. He escaped mainly through reading and remained a voracious reader for his life. He left home at the age of 16 to work on a canal boat, an incident which was later mythologized by Horatio Alger in his presidential campaign biography. After 6 weeks, he returned home, probably as a result of contracting malaria. His mother convinced him to return to school instead of going back to the canals. He's shown as a student at Geauga Academy, I'm not sure how that's pronounced, especially in languages and oratory. He had a religious awakening at a camp meeting and was baptized in 1850, and he then enrolled at the Western Reserve Eclectic Institute, run by a group called the Disciples of Christ. Initially, he worked as a janitor to help pay for his education, but he was such a good student that he was hired to teach while still a student. While there, he also wooed his future wife, Lucretia Rudolph, while teaching her Greek. He supplemented his income by preaching in nearby churches. 1854, he transferred to Williams College in Massachusetts, and after his first term there, he was hired to teach penmanship at a school in Pownell, Vermont, where previously Chester Arthur had taught. As an aside, he could write legibly with both hands, and he could write Greek with one hand while writing in Latin with the other. That's actually one of the few facts I knew about him before we started. He graduated from Williams as salutatorian in 1856, returned to Ohio. He was named president of the Western Reserve Eclectic Institute in 1857 and married Lucretia in 1858. But for economic and other reasons, he left education to read law in Cleveland. He was admitted to the bar in 1861. In August of 1861, he was commissioned as a colonel in the 42nd Ohio Infantry Regiment. He drove the Confederates out of eastern Kentucky and was promoted to brigadier general. He fought at Shiloh, Antietam, and that summer he was forced to return home by ill health. He hadn't been wounded. He returned to service in the autumn. He became chief of staff to Major General William Rosecrans in January of 1863 and performed well at the Battle of Chickamauga with a famous ride to rally the troops, and he was promoted to Major General while Rosecrans was sacked. He resigned his commission to take a seat in the House of Representatives in December of 1863 at Abraham Lincoln's request, and he had actually been nominated while he was at home on sick leave. He was a radical Republican, fiercely abolitionist and pro-black suffrage, and he favored confiscation of Southern property and the exile or execution of Southern leaders. He managed to pass a conscription bill eliminating commutation, whereby someone could provide money or a substitute if they'd been conscripted. Staunch backer of the gold standard, he was not a huge fan of Lincoln, but he changed his opinion, at least in public, following Lincoln's assassination. He opposed Andrew Johnson's policies, but eventually distanced himself from the radicals and went so far as to vote against the Ku Klux Klan Act in 1871. He continued to advocate for the gold standard, but he was a supporter of free trade. Served 9 terms in the House. Tom, I think before we get to his presidency, we should probably say a little bit about the radical Republicans and the Credit Mobilier scandal.
Absolutely, Richard. Lots of interesting things about the presidency, incredibly short presidency, as I guess we should announce a spoiler alert that Mr. Garfield is assassinated in this episode or near the end of this episode, perhaps even in the middle of this episode. It was second president assassinated. And we can go into that in a little bit of detail. But the couple of things that struck me, one was the Commutation Act. I think it was well known that you could pay a bounty and get out of your conscription What I hadn't fully appreciated, though, that the numbers of people who paid you didn't just pay to get out, you had to pay someone to take your place. So the troops allotments and quotas were filled, but the number of, I think in New York State, there were 10,000 conscripts required, 300 were non-paid positions. Perhaps there was an active market of men who were willing to enlist and get the Army dole, but I was frankly shocked by that. I was also very surprised to find Garfield's role as a radical Republican. We really didn't have a chance, I don't think I had the chance to explore his evolution, but it was clear he had evolved beyond the simple Thaddeus Stevens, Selman Chase, radical Republicans that we had seen in earlier podcasts, and really broke with them, I think, certainly near the end of Lincoln's life and the very first days of his second administration, but certainly throughout the Johnson administration. The credit Mobilier scandal is more difficult, and I think, unfortunately, puts a very, if not a dark light on Garfield, certainly a black eye. And it's from the research I did, it's not clear how much his role was. He, in some accounts I read, he made a profit of about $300, which I recognize is probably 100 times, maybe 50 times that today. So it was a relatively small sum in gross dollars in 1876 dollars or $1870. It would have been much higher, but he did accept the money. And that was a taint on him and a tarnish on him that he carried with him. And he really never fully explained that. The credit Mobilier scandal touched many politicians. It was a scandal around the Trans-Pacific Railroad, and lots of money was passed out and lots of stock was passed out to both senators and congressmen. And he was caught up in this, and I never saw a really good answer for it. So I was interested in your take on that.
He certainly wasn't alone. The way the scam worked was that Credit Mobilier had been formed and was secretly controlled by the officers and directors of the Union Pacific, and was given contracts to actually build the railroad, which then Credit Mobilier submitted hugely inflated invoices. It was permitted to purchase Union Pacific stock at par, which was substantially below market value, and it paid substantial dividends throughout its history. And the key to that was, of course, that the grossly inflated invoices had to be paid, which means Congress had to appropriate the money. And the key man behind it was a guy from Massachusetts named Oakes Ames, who offered his fellow congressmen the opportunity to purchase Credit Mobilier stock at par, basically in exchange for their votes. The vice president at the time, Grant's running mate, who subsequently became vice president, James Blaine, whose name keeps popping up during this time period, and Garfield were all implicated in it. I think he flat out lied about it. I initially thought he was merely being cagey, but I think he was dishonest in his representations of what he had done. It was a relatively small amount of money that he got, but he did vote for the appropriation. So I just think it's a terrible black eye. Among other things in his past that I skipped over, he was a member of the Electoral Commission that had given Hayes the presidency. He also voted for what was called the salary grab, where Congress gave itself a retroactive pay raise, which caused a great deal of outrage because there were a lot of lame ducks in Congress at the time who basically were looting the Treasury. And he supported that. So,
you know, that brings up, it seems to me, a nice place to talk about something that I certainly wasn't aware of in this part of history, which was a budget surplus. And I don't mean a $5 or $10 budget surplus, hundreds of millions of dollars of budget surplus that the United States generated. They generated this starting in the Civil War, which I found unbelievably astounding that you could generate a budget surplus during wartime, given the experience of America and subsequent wars. Nevertheless, they did it through increasing the tariffs. And that had several impacts, which we see throughout this time period. One was this huge budget surplus. It wasn't that we were running a deficit, or the government was running a deficit to pay these bribes. There was a big old trough of pig slop, and everybody was coming to eat. Yeah. And there was more money than they knew what to do with, literally. When I said 100, we saw figures as high as $150 million of budget surplus. You name one president in the last 50 years, and they would have died to have that kind of budget surplus. But the second impact was, to get that budget surplus, was the tariff. And manufacturing states, particularly in the Northeast and in the Midwest, wanted the tariff to be maintained because it it protected the nascent American factory life and the American worker by driving up the price of imported goods. And so we had this kind of two-pronged devil of this huge trough of food, or money, that politicians could just raid willy-nilly, being paid for largely by tariffs, so it wasn't being paid for by Americans directly with their tax dollars. But then you had this economic protectionism that was inflating wages. And I think it led to some dire circumstances later. So I was really intrigued by this, and particularly with what the politicians could do. We saw later presidents actually, I think, finally do something with this budget surplus in terms of infrastructure, but I'm not sure if they didn't know what to do with the money, or they didn't believe they could appropriate the money, but it just seemed to grow and grow, and it was not used.
I think that they were just reluctant to give up on these huge sources of income. There were excise taxes on a number of items as well, but it was primarily tariffs. And what was interesting to me is the tariff fights in the 1820s. Industry in the United States really was nascent and may have needed the protection. But at this point, industry in the United States was booming, and especially after 1880. So the need for the tariffs seems to have been vanishing. At the same time, the fight over it grew increasingly heated.
So then we had the nomination and the election, and from what I recall, Richard, Garfield was a bit of a dark horse candidate.
He was. The favorites were a man named John Sherman from Ohio, and Garfield was actually supposed to be managing his campaign since he'd just been elected to the Senate with Sherman's support. Blaine, again, and Grant. The Grant and Blaine supporters deadlocked, and Sherman apparently had no real support nationally, and so Garfield was nominated on the 36th ballot. Now, part of this was he was a reformer, so the Roscoe Conkling / Grant faction was pretty much against him. But as a sop to get their support, they agreed to name Chester Arthur, former collector of the Custom House of the Board of New York, as the vice presidential candidate, thinking that was not usually a road to success. The Democrats nominated Major General Winfield Scott Hancock, and who was a very lackluster candidate. And the Republicans started off sticking with their bloody shirt campaign, where they called the Democrats traitors and so forth, but they eventually switched to make tariff the key role in the election. Hancock made a couple of speeches that indicated he either didn't understand or didn't care about the issue, and Garfield won by fewer than 2,000 votes out of 9.2 million cast in the popular vote. But he won 214 to 155 in the Electoral College, so a handy victory there.
So let me just say a few words about waving the bloody shirt. Waving the bloody shirt was a term used to talk about your candidate as a Civil War veteran, as therefore a man of honor. But what surprised me, or had somewhat forgotten, was the part you raised, Richard. There was a part two of waving the bloody shirt, and that was that the Democrats had taken us into war, and indeed the Democrats were traitors. Now, I would ask you, once again, is there anything new in American politics that you would call your opponent a traitor to America?
Why no? I seem to have read something about that fairly recently.
It really just stunned me that these themes we're continually seeing over and over. But the waving the bloody, I think in our lifetime, certainly we have seen veterans use that honorably and successfully in campaigns. George H.W. Bush was our last serving World War II veteran. His son, George W. Bush, was our last president who has actually served in the military. And at one point, I think that meant something.
Yeah.
And, now I'm not so sure, but and maybe that's having an all-volunteer army or no major conflicts. Maybe that's not a bad thing, but the waving the bloody shirt really struck me. That was the second part, that the Democrats were traitors. But fortunately, by this election, that seemed to be wearing at it. And as I think you correctly noted, the election really turned on tariffs, and either a know-nothing speeches by Winfield Scott Hancock are really not caring.
Yeah. I think that the importance of being a veteran seems to be coming back into vogue, at least in the lower offices.
Yes.
A fair number of Congress people are now veterans of Iraq, Afghanistan, and so forth, and run on that basis, and it seems to be effective. So maybe they'll be climbing up the ladders, and we'll see it back. His presidency is well, short. He was shot about 200 days into it and lingered for a long time thanks to incompetent medical care and eventually died. But, he did accomplish a few things.
Before we get to his accomplishments, can I just say a few words about the assassination, though? Because, and this is for all you compliance practitioners listening out there, as everyone in America knows, and everyone in America knew at this point in time, Abraham Lincoln had been assassinated, and he had been shot, and he died in office. Every schoolboy learns that to this day. Apparently, there were no lessons drawn from that because there was no security with the president, and indeed, part of his job was to meet the public on a routine basis. But I was just stunned to find, I thought somehow the assassin, I believe Mr. Guiteau, Charles Guiteau, had been able to sneak into a group and get around some security guards, and a failure of security. It was not a failure of security. There was no security. And that's just not acceptable when you have your CEO is gunned down and you take no steps. I don't mean inefficient or ineffective steps, but you take no steps to protect your next CEO. I guess that's what really struck me about the assassination.
There were several things that struck me about it. Guiteau had sought a patronage office. He thought he should be, I think, consul to France or something, even though he didn't speak French. And he had actually met personally with Garfield at least once. And he'd met several times with the Secretary of State on the matter before being told that he was not going to get the office. And he apparently shot Garfield in the belief that Arthur would pardon him in exchange for becoming president and give him the office that he wanted. Insanity defenses not being what they are today, he was subsequently hanged. But anyway, it tarnished Arthur's ascent to the presidency because there was some implication that he was involved, although there's absolutely no evidence he was. But yeah. So failure on so many levels.
On to the presidency. So there was a couple of things that struck me about Garfield. One, that, and this really ties into the leadership discussion, in spite of the fact of his credit missteps, I thought he really moved towards certainly civil service reform and picked up where Hayes was not able to conclude and move the ball forward on civil service reform. We spoke about the post office corruption in a prior episode. He was able to clean up the post office corruption. And then there was one other incident that I once again have to bring to an attention, that this just struck me as nothing really ever changes, and that was the nomination to the Supreme Court of Stanley Matthews. And Matthews had been nominated to the court by Hayes, but he was nominated Hayes last year, and the Senate, amazingly enough, wouldn't even take up the nomination. Now, I'm not sure if that's ever happened before, but it happened.
And it certainly happened since.
And it certainly happened since. So that was point one. But here's the other thing about why Matthews had trouble getting confirmed as an appointee to the Supreme Court. He had been involved in the prosecution while district attorney of a newspaper editor who had assisted runaway slaves some 21 years before.
And he was a fervent abolitionist himself. He was simply doing his duty as district attorney to enforce the law.
So for those who look back on, I guess if you have politicians that are between 75 and 85, they're going to have a long career, and they may have done things in the past that may not look good in the eyes of current news and current events, or may not look good in your eyes if you didn't live when those prior events happened. But here we had literally a Supreme Court nominee denied even a hearing because of something you said absolutely spot on, doing his job some 21 years before, or at this point 22 years before, and a firm abolitionist. I just shook my head when I read that one.
He was confirmed.
He was
one vote.
Eventually confirmed, though. But there were a couple of other things. In addition to the civil service reform, there was still an ongoing debate on the tariff. And also a debate on something that we had talked about in earlier podcasts, which is the gold standard. But this debate really came to the fore in this era of U.S. presidents. And should the U.S. currency be backed on a dollar basis by gold or silver even? And Garfield was a gold bug. He believed that there should be full backing of gold. And the United States stayed on the gold standard, I believe, until the Roosevelt presidency. So it was quite a long run for the gold standard. Nixon.
Yeah, no, and that we'll be coming back to that over the next several presidencies.
Yes.
It remained a huge sticking point in American policy. The other thing that he did, which I thought was way ahead of his time was his proposal for universal education funded by the federal government. He was especially concerned. Reading his quotes, he would not pass muster for some of the things he said about black Americans, but he was terribly concerned that the governments in the southern states were not educating them quite correctly. And his solution to that was for the federal government to take a role in education.
I was really intrigued by that with Richard H. My parents were both teachers, so it was very important in my household growing up, and I was not aware of his role in advocating this. And he saw education of newly minted citizens, largely African Americans, as a way for them to not become a class of peasantry, as he phrased it, within the United States. He had been a teacher. You mentioned in the opening, when you went through his background, education was very important to him. Books were very important to him. And he had gone on to pinch hit, substitute teach at various locations. So this was obviously something that was very important to him. But I was really struck by his analysis of at least part of the problem was a lack of education and a solution to that problem, which was far ahead of its time.
Yeah. And so I think his very brief presidency is one of those that gives rise to a lot of counterfactual kind of speculation. Could he have gotten that through? Probably not, but it would have been interesting.
There were several hints of directions which I'm not sure I would call progressive, but they certainly were not regressive. We didn't even touch on foreign policy and most importantly naval reform that he started and increased under later presidents. And I guess I certainly knew he was one of the assassinated presidents, and I knew him for that reason. I knew he was assassinated by a disgruntled potential civil service candidate, all of those stories. But he had a lot of very interesting ideas that, had they come to fruition, I think really could have made a much different and outstanding mark. This was in spite of what I believe was his ethical misstep around Credit Mobilier.
Yeah, I think we agree on that, and it's just one of those fascinating what might have been kind of speculations. A lot of historians apparently don't even rank him among presidents because he served for such a short time, which may be the fair way to look at it.
Presidential Leadership Lessons was recently awarded by the Communicators as a podcast of distinction, and we're certainly thrilled to have won that award. Also, I would like to invite you to another podcast I recently concluded called Never the Same, which looks at business issues which have changed forever in the wake of the Russian invasion of Ukraine.